Welcome, and thank you for signing up for this course, Construction Management Secrets 1, Pre-Construction. To be honest, there's no real secrets in this course. I call it that to give it a catchy name. It does include a lot of tips and tricks and tools of the trade kind of thing that I have assembled over my 30-year career. Some of these items were taught to me by people in the business. Other ones I developed myself because I didn't find a good example to use. So some of these items you may do something similar, you may not, and maybe it gives you some good ideas for your project. Other things are some tips and tricks I did, over the years on projects to keep things moving. So they're suggestions. You may find them helpful. Hopefully, they'll be helpful in your next project. So, anyway, with that being said, the first lecture is Lecture 1, Project Kickoff. Notice of Award. So, what is a Notice of Award? Or also referred to as Letter of Award. It's a formal written notice of acceptance of a bid by the buyer, who is the owner, to the seller, who's the contractor, stating that upon compliance with the conditions of the procurement documents and within a specified time, the owner will sign and deliver a contract to the contractor. The notice of award is typically issued within 5 days from the bid date, with the date when the bids are opened. It can vary though. Sometimes they give you 10 days, could be 30 days, but typically it's fairly quickly because the owner is advantageous to get the project moving. So usually it's fairly quick, unless there's some major discrepancy in the bids, where one bid is substantially lower than 2, 3, and 4. Then they may decide to have some conversations first to make sure that the low bid is actually valid, or are they going to withdraw? And that slows the process down, and then they may have to issue it later after the first bidder drops out. Then they can go back to the second bidder. Anyway, so the 5 days can be a variable. It can change. So the letter typically includes a bunch of useful information. So it'll have obviously the date of the letter of award. It'll reference the project. It'll reference the successful seller and the scope of work awarded. Typically on a building, if it's an average size building, it'd be the entire project. But there could be projects where there's multiple phases, multiple buildings, or a highway project where there's, a road, a bridge, or in a tunnel, things like that, where sometimes there's a prime contractor and then they award it packages out to different bidders for different packages. So keep that in mind. It's usually the whole project, but it could be based on phases. It'll list the contract sum, the contract time, which is the duration of the project. Let's say, for example, a year, 365 days. That ties into the date of commencement and the date of completion. Obviously, when you start, add your duration, there's your completion date, also known as period of performance. There'll be the standard form of contract, which is the example of the contract the owner intends to issue to the contractor. Sometimes the contractor is allowed to review it and negotiate, make some changes to it. There could be typos in it, so they usually give you the standard contract. Most owners who've done a lot of building will have a standard contract. There might be other documents in there forming the contract. There'll be requirements on bonding and insurance. Some projects are bonded, some are not. Most public and federal jobs are bonded. Private, some are, some aren't. It depends on what the owner wants to do. But there will oftentimes there is a bonding requirement. There will be a requirement to obtain a necessary insurance policy. So, what kind of assurance is required and what's the aggregate value and that kind of thing, and who's required to be listed on a certificate of insurance. The permitted area of operations and access. Is there a laydown area specified for the contractor's sole use, things like that. And then there's usually a date on the issuance of the notice to proceed, and that's the document that actually kicks the project off and starts the clock ticking. Legal requirements. So legally binding. Generally, the notice award is not legally binding until it's signed by the successful contractor and returned to the owner. notice of award may include some similar language, something to the effect of notice of award will be legally valid and binding contract once the letter of award is accepted and signed by the successful contractor. Basically, it means we're offering you this project at this dollar value, and the contractor accepts it. If they don't accept it, there could be issues with their bid bond. So it's a legal binding agreement that you agree to do this project for this amount of time for this much money. It's not a contract. It's just basically saying you've been awarded the project. It's important to note that the formal contract may contain several amended or varied terms and conditions, and that the formal contract will supersede any other items and conditions agreed between the parties before the formal contract. So the notice of award may have also language that says something to the effect of this contract together with the contract documents shall constitute the entire agreement between the parties relating to the subject matter contained in or the obligations to be performed under this contract and shall supersede all communications, negotiations, commitments, understandings, and agreements previously agreed upon between the parties, whether oral, written, or otherwise. So basically, that's just a disclaimer you'll see sometimes on a notice of award, basically telling you that the contract is going to supersede the award. The contract should have all the information in it that's in the notice of award in terms of cost and time, duration, start date, and all that kind of stuff. So it just may have other things in it that aren't in the notice to proceed. The notice of award. Also, the contract may have more information in it that may not have been previously negotiated. Maybe there's the owner accepted an alternate that increased the project price, or they decided to withdraw scope or add scope, or maybe the date changed or the duration changed. Maybe they went to double shifts because they want to get it done faster. Things like that can change, and those may not be specified in the letter of award. So the contract supersedes the letter of award. Here's an example of a letter of award. This one's called a notice of contract award. Again, it's another name for the same document. Depending on your municipality, some people may call them different things. Again, you can see similar information, project information, the awarding authority, the contractor name, some scope on the project, the cost, the duration, starting time, location, and then it has some requirements that have to be notarized and sent to the owner, including certificate of insurance, payment materials bond, performance bond, and then it's usually signed by a representative of the owner. So that's typically what a notice of award looks like. Notice to proceed. Notice to proceed. So what is the notice to proceed? This contractually starts the project. It's a formal document authorizing an individual organization, i.e. the contractor, to commence the work under its contract, formally turning over the job site. The issuance of the notice to proceed typically marks the end of the procurement phase and establishes the date for commencement of the contract time. So basically the clock starts ticking. So if the notice to proceed is issued on June 1st, that's the day contractually everybody ties back to as the formal start of the project. The notice to proceed is issued only after the contract between the parties is fully executed and all the requirements of the notice of award have been completed, i.e. insurance, bond, licensing, etc. So you wouldn't issue the notice to proceed if you didn't have the proper insurance at hand, because that's a risky proposition. You wouldn't do that. So typically you wait till all the items are received, then you issue the notice to proceed. Also, you don't want to turn over your job site to a contractor if all these things aren't ready. So so once you get all those and everything's correct, insurances, bonds, licensing, all that kind of stuff is executed and correct, then you issue your notice to proceed. Standard contracts typically include a reference to the issuance of the notice to proceed, but typically they avoid including a firm date. it will often use terms like on or about before the date. So, for example, if you again were to issue a notice to proceed and you wanted to issue a notice to proceed on June 1st, your contract would say the owner intends to issue the notice to proceed on or about June 1st. This gives the owner some wiggle room, and it's done to prevent the owner from being bound to that date in the event that there are any delays on their behalf. That could be something on the um, owner's end, like for example, maybe there's an existing building they have to vacate, and something happens with the mover. They didn't move out June 1st. It wasn't until June 3rd, so they don't want to start the project with a 2-day delay. So typically, they won't issue the notice to proceed until they're 100% ready, and that's why they give a little bit of wiggle room in their language that says on or about, so they can't be held to it. Notice to proceed timeline summary. This is just a quick summary of, in my experience, how long this process takes from the days the bids are received till the day the contractor actually starts construction. So we'll just walk through it real quick. So step one, the owner collects the bids on the bid date, which is obviously established in the procurement documents on the instruction to bidders as well as the bid form. The owner reviews the bids and then issues a notice of award, typically within 7 days of the bid date. The contractor then signs and returns the notice of award. That's them formally agreeing to the contract in terms of time and scope and duration. Then the owner, once they get that signed back, starts to prepare the contract and issues the contract to the contractor, again, typically within 14 calendar days. The contractor then reviews and signs and returns it back to the owner along with the certificate of insurance, performance bonds, licenses, etc. There is a process in between here. Sometimes there's some negotiation going back and forth, usually between the owner and the contractor's attorneys over contract language. So that's why that process combined can take a while. Then the owner prepares and issues the notice to proceed after the contractor and the owner have executed the contract between each other. That typically takes, again, another 14 days. This is often issued at the pre-construction meeting. So right before the project kicks off, there's many different names for this. Sometimes they call it a pre-construction meeting. Sometimes they call it a kickoff meeting, whatever you want to call it. Usually there's a meeting held with all parties. They sit down, have a meeting to discuss the goals of the project and everything. Everybody introduces the team members to each other, and then the owner or owner's rep will typically hand the physical notice to proceed to the contractor. So that's typically when it's physically issued. Now, not always. It can be done by email, but that's typically the way I've seen it done. Then the contractor, once they have that in their hand, they can take possession of the job site and they can begin construction. Obviously, pending them obtaining all their required permits, but they usually can start to mobilize even if they're waiting for permits. The time between the bid date and the issuance of the notice to proceed can often take up to 60 days. It can take a while because all these steps, if any of them go faster, great. But the way I laid this out is, it could take 60 days. All right, notice to proceed options. So there are some options with the notice to proceed. Traditionally, the notice to proceed is just handed to the contractor. The owner issues it, allows the contractor to start to mobilize at the site and start construction while they're waiting for the building permit. So they can get out, they can set up the job trailer, they can put up the construction fence, and they're not really doing any work, but they're mobilizing. So they're ramping up, if you will. The other option is what I call more of a hybrid option, which is the pre-construction notice to proceed. This happens a lot on federal and state projects. The owner issues a pre-construction notice to proceed, which is typically a set period, and I'll say 60 days. That's how often I've seen it used. That allows time for the contractor to perform pre-construction activities without the clock ticking. And activities often performed within this time frame include permitting, subcontracting, long lead submittals, procurement of materials, background checks, and the development of a baseline schedule. So they can include other items. Those are some items. So it's kind of giving the contractor a head start without really the clock ticking. But the clock is ticking because they only have so many days to get some of these activities done, unless there's a reason um, that slows this down. Um, Typically, at the end of 60 days, the owner will then issue what they call a construction notice to proceed, which is that's the formal kickoff of the job. So you have so many days to now finish the construction. So both time frames should be in the contract, and it should tell the contractor that, well, look, we're going to give you notice to proceed to do your pre-construction activities. Let's say it's 60 days. Subtract that from the year-long duration, and then the remaining duration would be construction and closeout. So a lot of these items I'll talk throughout this course, um, but that is an option, and it does happen a lot, especially with federal and state projects. If there's a lot of background checks, if you're doing works in schools or in federal buildings or in prisons or things like that, a lot of times they really have to do a thorough background check of all the employees and companies, sometimes financial background checks as well, to make sure everything is okay before they issue the construction one. Because if there's a hiccup and certain workers can't work or something, they may need to give the contractor time to, get a substitution, whether it's a subcontractor or just an employee or whatever. The construction notice to proceed, like I said, the owner issues a construction notice to proceed, which should take effect immediately after the pre-construction notice to proceed expiration. So again, this should signify the start of the contract duration. This is when the contractor is authorized to mobilize the site and start construction. The clock starts ticking. This is really a construction phase of the project. But again, you need to make sure that this is both of these, the notice to proceed and the pre-construction notice to proceed and the construction notice to proceed, are identified in the contract. You don't want to just surprise the contractor with this. So the notice to proceed, either option, is usually issued at the pre-construction kickoff meeting, which I talked about. And again, this is on a lot of federal projects. Some states have this as well. You don't see too often, but it is out there. You could use it on a private job if you wanted to. There's no reason not to. You just need to make sure that you make these clear in the contract. The contract should make it clear that the owner will be issuing separate notice to proceed, and that any delays due to the contractor's efforts, example subcontracting, will not be relieved. Make sure to consult an attorney accordingly. So basically what I'm saying here is, this is kind of my commentary, basically saying you can tell them all this stuff and let them use it in their best interest, but you got to tell them that 60 days is up. You got to start construction. If they're not ready, then that's on them. So just keep that in mind. Permitting. So traditional permitting. So what's traditional permitting? So the contractor typically is responsible for obtaining all required building permits and paying all permit fees, including the building permit, which I may refer to as the main building permit, and the associated trade permits. That should be your mechanical, electrical, plumbing, any other permit required by the building department. So building permits can often take up to 30 calendar days to obtain, and contractors typically do not apply for the building permit until they receive the notice to proceed, unless the contract states otherwise. So typically, there's a lot of things going around negotiating the contract. A lot of times the contractor doesn't want to put in the effort or get the building permit process moving until they know that this project is legit and they're going to actually get a contract. So they typically won't go in until they get their contract and the notice to proceed is issued. The owner may decide to accelerate the permit process by filing for the building permit themselves once the bids are open and they confirmed they're within budget. And I'll go through that a little bit more in the next slide. There also may be other permits, such as the DEP terrain alteration permit or a wetlands permit, like a SWIP, which usually is obtained during design, but other permits such as road opening permits, water connection permits, sewer discharge permits, these may all need to be obtained prior to the construction, depending on the scope and the time frame. So there's a lot of permits sometimes outside of the building permit that are required. Some of them tie to the building permit, meaning you have to have some of these first. Other ones don't. Federal and state projects often do not have any required permits, but many states do require a state building permit. Make sure that you check with your local municipality to confirm what's required. So then there's some permitting options. So when you have a building permit that there's no permit fee, there's a couple options here. So if there is no permit fee, the owner can apply for the building permit once the bids are opened to help accelerate the permitting process, then transfer it over to the contractor once the notice to proceed is issued. The benefit here is it saves time and there's no financial risk. This allows the contract to hit the ground running, and the owner will usually assign this effort to a permit expediter on the owner's behalf. So I did this role before. I was a permit expediter. I worked on a lot of Walmart projects. So during the design, we would go out and we would sit down with the municipality, find out all the permits we need. Some were federal, some were state, some were local. We'd have all the permits aligned before the project went out to bid. You just got to be careful because if you pull the permits too early, you could have issues because they're only allowed a certain amount of time before they expire. But usually, if once you start construction, it's irrelevant. There's no time you have to finish the building. You just have to start it within a certain period of time. Just make sure you check with your local municipality if there's any issues with the owner pulling the permit. Also, if there's no permit fees, the contractor can also apply for the building permit after the notice of award to help accelerate the permitting process and have it in hand once the notice to proceed is issued. The benefit, again, here is it saves time and there's no financial risk because there's no permit fee. This allows the contractor, again, to hit the ground running. Either option should be discussed ahead of time with the contractor and spelled out in the contract. It's very important that whoever obtains the permit, they are the person responsible for overseeing the construction, and make sure that they transfer the permit over to someone that is to avoid any liability. So if the owner pulls a permit, you're responsible for the project. You want to make sure you turn that over to the contractor if they didn't pull it themselves once construction starts. Then there's permitting fees. So when you do have permitting fees, so if there are permit fees, this happens a lot on private jobs, the owner can apply for the building permit to help accelerate the project so that the permit is in hand and transfer it over to the contractor when the notice to proceed is issued. The benefit again is it saves time, but they assume the permit risk. This allows the contract to hit the ground running. The owner would then have to backcharge for reimbursement for the permit fee, unless the contract says that the owner is going to pay the building permit. Sometimes the owner will accelerate it. They'll pay the permit fee, they'll get moving, and then they'll just backcharge the contractor. It can be a dispute sometimes because when the permit's pulled, you know the actual permit fee. Sometimes when your contract is bid, they'll take their best guess because the building department may or may not have a permit scale on their website that tells you how much per square foot or whatever. Owners have a little bit more leeway sometimes with the building department. They can negotiate the fees. So you can have a little bit of dispute between the owner and the contractor in terms of back charges. So just keep that in mind. If there are permit fees, the contractor can apply for the building permit after the notice of award as well to help accelerate the project so that the permit is in hand when the notice to proceed is issued. Again, the benefit is it saves time, but they assume the permit cost. This allows the contractor to hit the ground running. So this is the contractor risk because he could go and pull the permit and then for whatever reason, economy crashes, there's a pandemic, something bad happens, maybe something happens to the site, there's a flood, and now all of a sudden the contractor's out money because the owner doesn't want to proceed with the project anymore. They take the risk because now they paid for the permit and they're never going to build the building. So then they'd have to go back and try and get reimbursed either by the owner or go back to the building department and cancel the permit. So again, it's another risk. Doesn't happen very often that something crazy like that happens, but again, keep it in mind that it is an option. Either option should be discussed ahead of time with the contractor and spelled in the contract. So if all this is allowed, make sure you put it in the contract, especially if you're going to go after any type of reimbursement. Also, it is very important to whomever obtains the permit that they're the ones responsible, and if they're not, they should transfer it to the party that is. All right. What are some other permitting options? So, depending on the scope of the project and your local municipality regulations, some building departments will issue permits on certain phases of the work prior to the full building permit. So, if you have a very complex building, hundreds of sheet long, multiple different trades, um, building inspector has the option based on the IBC to spend up to 30 days to review and respond. Doesn't mean they have to approve, they just have to review and respond. They might respond asking for more information or clarify things, or they may want drawings revised and resubmitted. So they have to reply within 30 days, not necessarily issue the permit. However, there are a couple other options that you can pursue. I've done these before. Again, you got to check with your local municipality, make sure these are viable options. But I've had projects where I've done just a demolition only permit. That allowed me to start the demolition of existing structures, commence with the work that needs to happen prior to the new work starting. This could require additional permits as well and protection plans in place. You might have to have your SWIP in place. You might have to have your BMPs in place. You might have to get something on a lead or asbestos permit with the state. Even if you don't have any, you might have to get at least your clearances in place, that kind of stuff. But it allows you to tear down the old building while you're waiting for the new building plans to be approved and a permit issued. There's kind of a risk because what happens if something happens and they don't issue the building permit and the plans have to be substantially revised. Now the owner's in it and you already tore the building down. So it's a risk, but typically it's not that much of a risk because usually a building is abandoned, usually not occupied. So just keep that in mind. Earthwork only permits, I've seen these too, where you had a big piece of land that maybe there was a lot of cut or a lot of fill. So this permit allows the earthwork to commence, typically clearing and grubbing and cut excavation if the work needs to happen prior to the new foundations being installed. So you may have to bring in a lot of material, compact it, place it, compact it, have it all tested, all that kind of thing. Or maybe you're cutting it. Maybe it's a big mound and you have to cut it and export it. There might be a lot of soil stuff that can happen before the building permit is issued. But again, it's a risk because you could clear this whole land and now something again happens with the building permit and now you don't have a building. So it's a risk, but it's a small risk. But it's an option to keep in mind. And then the last one would be the foundation only permit. So again, these kind of fall in line with each other. And this permit allows the contractor to have the foundation placement started before they start the full, before the full building permit is issued. So again, there is a little bit of risk. Usually, if it takes a building inspector, the foundation is usually, if it's a standard foundation, it's quick review. They can review it and give you a foundation permit. It allows you to start excavating for footings and placing concrete. So hopefully you catch up and get a jump start on things while they're reviewing the building. So it is an option. Again, I'm sure you've seen them. I've seen projects where you see foundations in the ground and then they just sit there and they've sat there for years and you wonder what happened. Could have been the owner's financing fell through. Could have been there was a code change that required something crazy like the small little building now had to be sprinkled and now it's going to cost too much money, blah, blah, blah. So there is a risk, but it also is a reward. So all these things here allow you to get jump start on the project, which is always a good thing because time is money to everybody. Again, these permits are discretionary, but if allowed, they can help keep the project moving forward. Also, all necessary submittals should be approved. So you should make sure that you have your concrete, mixed designs, your rebar, earthwork, all your different types of fill, proctors, and sieve analysis, all that kind of stuff approved before you do any of this work. Make sure you have all your smaller permits in hand too so that there's no issues. NFPA 241 planning. So I have a whole class on this. I'm going to give you a quick summary. I noted it here at the bottom. It's very detailed and it's very long, so I'm not going to go through all the aspects of it. Just a quick overview to give you an idea. But this is something you need to start at the beginning of the project, preferably during design. But if that doesn't happen, it should at least happen during the pre-construction phase before you start working, especially on an existing building. But it also applies to new buildings. So what is NFPA 241? So NFPA 241 is safeguarding construction, alteration, and demolition operations And it is a standard intended to prescribe the minimum safeguards for construction, alteration, and demolition operations in order to provide reasonable safe to life and property from fire during such operations. So it's the minimum standard. You can always do more, but it outlines all these different criteria and what you need to do to minimize any issues during a fire, especially at a construction site. So this standard provides measures for preventing or minimizing fire damage during construction, alteration, and demolition operations. Alteration activity shall be permitted to require the use of both demolition and construction activity requirements as applicable. So basically, alterations in an existing building is different than a ground up building. So what happens during demolition could change because now you may have like exposed wood framing that was covered with drywall before, and then when you later on when you get the construction, you're covering it all again. So things can evolve. So you need to make sure that this plan is fluid and changes based on different phases of the project. Fire safety plan shall be included in all construction, alteration, and demolition contracts, and it's the right of the owner to administer and enforce this program. And it shall be established even if the building is entirely under the jurisdiction of the contractor. Even though you gave them a notice to proceed and the contractor is running the show and it's his job, it's still your job to enforce this program. And it should be started, like I said earlier, during design. There's another standard called NFPA 1620, which is the standard for pre-incident planning. And that's basically the owner does their homework on the site and the existing building, especially noting where everything is. So you know where the fire hydrants are, you know where the pole boxes are and telephone poles, you know where the roads are, you know access to your site, you know if there's any underground utilities you got to be aware of, or any overhead hazards like overhead wires, things like that. You should know all that and you should be able to communicate that to the contractor. So again, you can take my course on it. It's very informative, a lot more information. So you can check that out if you want. All right, so here's some quick facts on it, just to give you kind of a brief summary. If your municipality has adopted NFPA 1 or the IBC, which has adopted NFPA 1 as part of it, NFPA 241 requirements are not an option, they're mandatory. Again, check with your local municipality on what they want, but you can't ignore it. It's required. It's mandatory. You can't get around it. You have to do something. Your local municipality might be strict on it. They may be a little less restrictive on it, but you need to do something. So owners are required to prepare what I call a master fire prevention program in conformance with NFPA 241, and it should include hot work inspections and impairment work programs. Again, the owner should start pre-incident planning during the design. So basically, I call it a program because an owner could have multiple buildings on the same site, or they could have a portfolio of buildings. So if they write a program, it kind of is a one-size-fits-all, and it covers pretty much every situation. And they just need to update it routinely as NFPA 241, and any other related documents get updated. But the owner is also required to employ a fire prevention program manager, or an FPPM. I went through this training myself. It's not very lengthy program to pass, but it's through the NFPA, and there's certain tests and program online training you have to take, and you can become an FPPM. The owner is responsible for administering the fire prevention program, so they're responsible for it. It's their building. You're the one insured by insurance company. You want to protect your investment, right? The contractor is also required to what is referred to as a project-specific fire prevention plan. So I call it a plan, and it's called a plan because a plan is more detailed than a program. This is then it's designed for that certain project. That's why it's called project specific, right? Because building the same building across the street may have different requirements because of its site and items that could change from one site to the other, even though you're building the same building. So that's why you make a project specific, because all the things that are on that site may impact that plan. So it's a plan. Contractors also required to have their own Contractor fire prevention manager. Sometimes this is their safety manager. So they have to have somebody that's going to enforce the program on their behalf. Could be a third party. They could hire their own FPPM if they want, or they could have it in house. Depends on the size of the contractor. Contractors are responsible for adhering to this project specific fire prevention plan. So they wrote their plan, they need to follow it. So their FPPM should be making sure they're following it, and then the owner's FPPM should be make sure they're following it. Some municipalities may require an affidavit signed by the owner's FPPM manager prior to the issuance of the certificate of occupancy. So this has happened up in here in Boston, where I'm from, Boston and Cambridge, and I think Providence has some similar things going on too, where they won't give you an occupancy permit unless you have an affidavit from an FPPM that things will follow during construction. So check with your local municipality, see if they have such a requirement. You certainly don't want to get to the end of the job and find out you needed one. It's kind of tough to back things up. But anyway, that's just something you should be aware of. Special inspection planning. Again, this is another owner requirement. It's very detailed. I have a separate course on this as well because there's a lot of parts to it. It's very detailed. Please check that out. You'll learn a lot. So what is special inspection? So special inspections is defined by the current International Building Code under Chapter 17 as inspection of construction requiring the expertise of an approved special inspector in order to ensure compliance with the code and the approved construction documents. Special inspections includes both testing and inspection of materials, installation, fabrication, erection, and placement of components and connections to ensure compliance with the code, reference standards adopted by the code, and approved construction documents. Special inspections is another form of quality assurance, which unfortunately most people treat as a necessary evil or part of the process or hassle, and that it only slows things down. But it protects your investment. You want to make sure if the person's installing whatever they say they're going to install, they're doing it correctly, especially when it comes to life safety items like steel and foundations and concrete and masonry and things like that. And special inspection planning, again, starts at design. That's my experience. That's right. Think it starts the most because you know what you're building because you're designing it. So you should start to lay out your inspections program as you're designing. And again, there's some information on the course. All right, so special inspection facts. So special inspection facts. So here's all the players, and I'm just going to go through the kind of list of their responsibilities so you understand what everybody's role is. So the design team, they're the ones who develop the special inspection program. Often they issue something called a statement of special inspection. It's a form, multiple pages long. It lists each part, assembly, if you will, of the building, steel, concrete, masonry, earthwork, and things like that. And it tells you what they want to test it to, how often it should be tested, and who should be tested by. It also should list what the intended results are. So that's the statement of special inspections. The code enforcement officer, also known as the building inspector, they're the ones who approve the program. Some municipalities require the statement of special inspections to be submitted as part of the building permit process. So they'll review that as part of when they're reviewing the plans. And then they can add to it if they want, or they might think things are not necessarily. There could be a typo that's not required based on the scope of the project, but they could also say, hey, I want this tested, and I want this tested by a certain type of individual. Maybe they don't want an ACI 1 testing something. Maybe they want a certified masonry inspector. So it's their prerogative. They're the ones at the end of the day issuing the building occupancy permit. The owner, they're the ones that finance the special inspection program. So they should be involved. They should know how much this is going to cost and allocate that in their budget. Then you have the special inspection coordinator. They're the ones that administer the inspection program. Then there's the testing agency inspectors. They're the ones that go out and actually perform the special inspection tests. Sometimes the special inspection coordinator and the testing agency are one and the same. That they could work for them. But not all the time. Sometimes the structural engineer of record sometimes will serve as the special inspection coordinator. and then the testing agency inspectors are a third party. And then you have the contractor. Basically, their job is to schedule it all. They're the ones that are building the job. They know when they're placing the fill. They know when they're installing the steel and the masonry and the concrete. They know, and they know this process and they know it well. So they typically are the ones that have to provide you access and make sure they schedule the tests and inspections accordingly. All right, that's the end of lecture 1. Please continue on to lecture 2, and we'll talk about insurances and bonds.